Our text for this morning is Psalm 27, verse 1. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? For David, the world was a dark and dangerous and frightening place. Throughout his whole life, David was surrounded by danger. Think of him as a young boy. He faced lions and bears and wolves as he looked after his father's sheep. Think of him then as a young man, chased upon the mountaintops by wicked King Saul. And then when he was older and he became king himself, his life did not get any easier because he was pursued by his wicked and conniving son Absalom, fleeing out of the land of Israel into a foreign land with only a handful of faithful followers. And most commentators believe that the setting of this psalm is that third one, when Absalom was chasing David out of his kingdom. At that time, the majority of the nation had abandoned him, and he was surrounded by cruel and ungodly men. Notice verse 2. When the wicked, even mine enemies and my foes, came upon me to eat up my flesh, they stumbled and fell. At that time he was slandered by wicked and cruel tongues. That's verse 12. Deliver me not over unto the will of mine enemies, for false witnesses are risen up against me, and such as breathe out cruelty. Think of Ahithophel, and think of Shimei, who cursed him as he left Israel. And he has at this time too a most grievous trial. He is not able to go to the temple or the tabernacle to worship his God. He is in exile. We have that too, verse 4. One thing have I desired of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. At this time, as he writes Psalm 27, he is not able to dwell in the house of the Lord. And so he desires earnestly of God that God would restore him to Israel. And again he says later on in this psalm, he seeks God's face. He asks to be able to go into the tabernacle. Verse 13, I had fainted unless I had believed to see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. A life of trials. David's life was not easy. A life of trials. And yet, throughout all of this darkness, one light shone for him. And that was his faithful God, Jehovah. And that is his confession in our text. The Lord is my light and my salvation. No matter how dark it becomes for David, David confesses this. The Lord is my light and my salvation. That's where his trust lies. That's where he finds hope and joy and confidence. He trusts in the faithfulness of Jehovah God. And that knowledge, that God is light and salvation to those who believe in him, that knowledge sustains us through our many trials also, because the world has not got any easier for the child of God. It's still dark, it's still dangerous, and as sin develops in the midst of this world, we see it becoming more dark and more dangerous, and we know eventually Antichrist is going to come, and that will be the darkest period in the history of the world. And our natural response then is to be afraid. But this psalm is for our comfort. Do not be afraid, beloved. The Lord is your light and your salvation. Every believer can exclaim with David, Jehovah is my light and my salvation. Jehovah, our light and our salvation. First of all, what, then who, and with what result. Jehovah, our light and our salvation. What, who, and with what result. This is a psalm, and therefore it is a poem, poetic language. We have here the figure of light, a rich concept in Scripture. Light is a picture of life, of hope, of joy, and of knowledge or guidance in the midst of darkness. Darkness and gloominess are depressing. There's no hope in the midst of darkness. But we have a saying in English, there's light at the end of the tunnel. A picture of hope. Light is hope and brings joy. Children are afraid of the dark. But when the light is turned on, they have hope and they have comfort. And when you walk in the darkness, you can't see where you're going, you stumble and you fall, because light is a picture of knowledge which pierces through our ignorance so we can see as God shines upon our pathway. And light is also a picture in the Bible of God's favour and grace shining upon us. Think of the Aaronic blessing. May God's face shine upon you. God shines upon his people in favour and in love. So it's life, hope, joy, knowledge, favour, and the glory of God. All of these things are encapsulated by that one word, light. Just look through the Psalms. And many times that word light is used throughout the Psalms, and you will see what a rich concept it is. Now David writes that God is his light, not in the abstract, but in the midst, as we said, of many trials and tribulations. David's life was constantly in threat from enemies who plotted his ruin. He calls them in verse 2 his foes and his enemies. And they come as if they are wild beasts to eat up his flesh. In verse 3, he is surrounded by them. Though an host should encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. A host is a mighty army. In those days, an army numbering thousands and tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of soldiers. That was what David faced upon the battlefield. All armed with spears and swords and bows. And yet, they stumbled and they fell. And David escaped miraculously from their clutches. His whole life was full of trials. He knew persecution. He knew the mocking and slander of wicked men. And his life itself was threatened by persecution. He knew the loss of all of his possessions. Think of this. He was the king of Israel. He lived in a wonderful palace, surrounded by servants. And in the next moment, his wicked son usurps him, and he must flee, leaving all of that behind, and now lives in the wilderness with a few faithful men. He lost everything. And think of the trials in his family. One son murdered another son. And now his son Absalom is trying to kill his own father. And worse than all of that is the fact that he knows that his son Absalom is a wicked, ungodly man who eventually is going to perish under the wrath of God. And remember his terrible lament, "Oh, Absalom, my son, Absalom, my son, Absalom." The grief of a father seeing his son turn away from the God of truth and from the truth of the Scriptures which he was taught.